take this bar off, take these 4 nuts off, use a 13mm socket. Just going to use a pull jack and support the exhaust so it doesn't fall. Remove these 2 nuts, use a 13mm socket. Remove these 3 nuts on this side. If you have dual exhaust, then you're going to have to remove them from both sides. Use a 13mm socket. There is a ground strap on this one. You want to take that off. This one's ground strap is broken, so it's not a big deal. And use a pry bar. Just pry this bracket off. Just out of the way. Do the same on the other side. Take these 2 nuts off. Use a 16mm socket. Now carefully lower the exhaust. You might want to use a helper to help you remove this. It's awful heavy. And lower it down. Remove the wheel, use a 21mm socket. Take the lug nuts off. Take the wheel off. Remove the brake caliper with the bracket. Take these 2 bolts out on the back. Use a 19mm socket. Slide the caliper off. Just use a caliper hook or a hanger. And just hang it on the brake line bracket. Put a lug nut on the rotor just to keep the rotor from falling off, or you could just take the rotor off. You're going to take the bolts out for the sway bar link bracket. Use a 14mm socket. Just to take the tension off the sway bar, I'm going to take the same bolts out of the other side, lower that bracket as well. This harness is for the ABS, or for the wheel speed sensors. So just disconnect the connectors. Right here, you can just push down on the tab. Slide the connector out. Same with that one. And there's a retainer right here. So get under there with a trim tool, pry that out, just so you don't break this wiring harness, just in case. I'm gonna put a pull jack underneath the lower control arm, just raise up so to take the tension off the shock. Then we'll take that shock bolt out. Use a 17mm socket, take this bolt out. Just gonna use a wrench to just pry the bolt out while I loosen it. To take it out. There you go. Now I can lower down the pull jack and just pry the shock out. I'm going to use a pull jack and support the cradle on this side. On this other side, I'm putting the pull jack right here. I'm going to take this bracket off, take these 2 bolts out, use a 16mm socket. Take this nut off, use a 21mm socket. Hold the plate while you're doing that. Slide the plate out. Take this nut off, use the same 21mm socket. On the opposite side, take this plate off, use a 16mm socket. Take these 2 bolts out. Use a 21mm socket, take this nut off, and then just put the nut back on with just a couple threads, just so this doesn't come off completely. Back one as well. You just take this nut off and just put this back on, just a couple threads. Now we're going to lower this down very carefully and watch out for the spring. Once you get to that point, then you can lower this side down a little bit. Take this bracket off that goes to the wheel speed sensor wiring harness. Use a 10mm socket. We're going to take the nuts off that go to the upper control arm bushings, but we want to leave the bolts in there. Use an 18mm wrench, and then use a long extension with some type of impact swivel or just an impact socket, and 18mm. And loosen this up. And just take that nut off. And on the back one, do the same. All right, so leave those bolts in there for right this second. And remove this cotter pin. Just use some side cutters. Use a 19mm socket. Take this nut off. There we go. And now they just slide up on this. If this didn't separate, you could use a pickle fork or some other type of ball joint puller or remover. Slide these bolts out. Take the arm and just slide it out. You need to take this cone off. Just use some pliers and grab it. You can transfer this over to the new one. If this cone keeps falling off, you can just take the cone and put it in the knuckle right there. And slide the control arm back in position. Throw the new one. Take the bolts, get the bolts lined up. They go from the inside out. Just line the ball joint up with the knuckle, push that down. You can get the nut started underneath. We'll tighten that down in a minute. Put the nuts on. And snug those up, and then torque these to 52 foot-pounds. Do the best you can. It's not that easy to get a torque wrench in here. And do the same on the back one. Now tighten down the nut. If you had trouble tightening this nut up, if the stud kept spinning, what you can do is support the lower part of the knuckle and then use a pry bar and pry down on the upper part of the control arm. And that'll put friction on it so it won't spin. Then torque this nut to 70 foot-pounds. Make sure the hole for the cotter pin lines up with the castle nut. If it doesn't, just tighten it a little bit more till it lines up. And slide your cotter pin through. Use some side cutters and just bend it. And once it's bent, just trim the excess. And now we can raise up on the pull jack. While you're doing that, line the shock up. It'll be a little easier to get this started. Make sure you do these evenly. Just go back and forth. Now I can put the shock bolt in, get that started, and torque this bolt to 88 foot-pounds. Put these mount washers on and the nut. Do the same on this side. And put these shields back on. Get the nut on and get these bolts started. Do the same on this side. Now torque all these nuts to 88 foot-pounds. Snug them up first. And snug these down. Same on the other side. Now we can lower the pole jacks. Be careful when doing this. If you're doing this in your driveway, make sure you have extra support under the vehicle. The vehicle's very unstable when you're lowering this. Hook up the electrical connector under here, lock it in place, and push down on the retainer. And line this bracket back up. Put that bolt in and snug it up. And take the hanger off the caliper. Make sure you separate the pads and slide them over the rotor. Line this bracket up and put the bolts back in. Now torque these bolts to 62 foot-pounds. Now reinstall the sway bar bracket. And do the same to the other side and tighten them down. Now reinstall the exhaust. Alright. And make sure you have some of the nuts in your hand. Get those started on the mount so it doesn't fall. And get the bracket in the rear lined up. Get the bolts started. And same with the other side. Good idea to replace this seal when you're doing this as well. Whenever you take that off, put a new seal on there. Get these nuts started as well. Once all the nuts are started, you can snug them all down. Now reinstall this piece and the nuts. And tighten these down. You can remove the pole jack, take the lug nut off the rotor, and put the wheel back on. Put the nut on. Now I'm going to torque the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. Just go around again, double check. After you've done this job, make sure you just pump the brake pedal. You did have the caliper off for a little bit. There might be a little bit of an air gap there. And make sure you bring the vehicle to a local garage to have it aligned. You don't want premature tire wear.